The Cuban Missile Crisis occurred from October 16th to the 28th in 1962, a time spanning 13 days. This time, also known as the Missile Scare, is known as one of the most important and most strenuous times in American history, as it is the closest we have ever come to a nuclear war. In this time, the United States learned that the Soviet Union had been placed ballistic nuclear missiles inside Cuba, a former ally of them. The United States at the time was John F. Kennedy. He was sworn into office January 20th, 1961, and his term ended when he was assassinated November 22nd, 1963. He is best known for being the leader of the United States during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and before that, in April 1961, was the one who ordered the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a failed invasion of Cuba to overthrow Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was the Prime Minister of the Republic of Cuba from 1959 to 1976 and was seen as the main ally of Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro formed an alliance with the Soviet Union and allowed them to place the nuclear weapons on the island. Nikita Khrushchev held office from September 14th, 1953 to October 14th, 1964. He was the leader of the Soviet Union during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Is one of the photos shown to President Kennedy at the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. These pictures indicated that there were indeed missiles in Cuba right under the nose of the United States. Kennedy felt betrayed by this as he was thought to have a good relationship with Khrushchev and instead found out that he was having missiles sent to the United States backyard under Kennedy's nose. As a result of this newfound threat in their backyard, President Kennedy established XCOM, which was a group of his very most trusted allies and officials which he felt could best handle the situation. Included was Kennedy himself, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, the Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Douglas Dillon, the Secretary of the Treasury, Robert Kennedy, Attorney General and the brother and most closest ally of President Kennedy, John McCone, Director of Central Intelligence, and General Maxwell Taylor, Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. One of the most important roles held by Robert Kennedy was his meetings with Anatoly F. Dobrynin, who was the ambassador for the Soviet Union for the United States. These two would have negotiations about the bombs, which was direct communication which was difficult between Khrushchev and Kennedy. In response to this newfound threat in his backyard, President Kennedy ordered a blockade of any Soviet ships entering Cuba. This was done with first the Walnut Line from the 24th to the 31st of October 1962. Later, that line was brought back a bit with the Chestnut Line, which was after the Cuban Missile Crisis. One line in particular, as seen in gray, was the line that, if passed by the Soviet Union, the warships would be deployed. Throughout the Cuban Missile Crisis, ships did pass through the blockade after extensive searches to ensure there were no missiles or weaponry on the ships. On October 22nd, 1962, President Kennedy interrupted television broadcast to have one of his most famous speeches, the address of the Cuba situation. He finally revealed to the public what was happening in their backyard and prompted them to stay calm and collective during this time. Immediately, it was found that most Americans supported the blockade as announced by Kennedy at the time, with only a few select believing it would result in a war. In the days following his announcement, President Kennedy's XCOM advisors would be in continued negotiation and conferences about this crisis. Kennedy and his delegates would have to decide whether they thought that force would have to be used and a war would have to begin over this. While Kennedy really did not want war, his advisors thought it was almost inevitable. During this time, Kennedy experienced much stress and spent almost 80% of his time on Cuba. One of the most trying days of the Cuban Missile Crisis was October 27, 1962, also referred to as Black Saturday. On Black Saturday, a U.S. U-2 spy aircraft was shot down, resulting in the death of Rudolph Anderson Jr., the pilot at the time. Kennedy was adamant that if any blood were to be spilled during this time, he would not hesitate in deploying missiles and effectively starting another war. However, even though he was advised to start such a war, he decided to withhold. He chalked it up as a mistake after conversations with Khrushchev, and as a result, very narrowly dodged another world war. Shown here is the last page of Khrushchev's letter to Kennedy on October 26, 1962. This letter is important as it showed Khrushchev expressing his desire for this conflict to end. However, the United States, especially Kennedy in particular, were not totally certain that this was written by Khrushchev. Thus, Black Saturday occurred as they waited for Khrushchev to finally give his official thoughts. On top of that, they thought this might be some type of game or exploit done by Khrushchev to give him more time to set up the missiles. Thus, this resulted in a very strenuous and difficult time on Saturday, as Kennedy tasseled with his delegates whether or not to start the war. On October 27, 1962, the United States learned from Khrushchev that he would effectively remove the missiles from Cuba, given the United States removed their missiles from Turkey, which was the backyard of the Soviet Union. Americans expressed their delight and joy as another world war had been diverted. However, Cuba was not as happy. Castro believed that it was necessary to take out the United States, and he was not told of the decision to take missiles out of Cuba. Khrushchev made the decision behind his back, and he felt very betrayed. Regardless, the two still held a relationship given both their practice of communism. The resolution between the United States and the Soviet Union occurred on October 28th. The blockade stayed in effect for nearly another month. The United States government eventually announced that the blockade would end at 6:45 p.m. Eastern Time on November 20th, 1962. With this end of the blockade, the Cuban Missile Crisis could effectively come to a complete end. Nikita Khrushchev, while avoiding a nuclear catastrophe, was seen as weak following this agreement with the United States. Only 2 years later, in 1964, he was removed from office. Following the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy would continue to deal with the Soviets during this time known as the Cold War. However, his tenure was very much cut short in 1963. On November 20, President Kennedy was assassinated only a year later on November 22, 1963, while being in Dallas, Texas for a motorcade parade. This death resulted in a very, very swift and unfortunate end to Kennedy's very promising beginning to his presidency. How Kennedy's death impacted the United States is for another time. For now, please refer back to the readings I assigned to have a better understanding of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Please come into class with any questions you may have or any problems you came across. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the rest of your day.